good afternoon to everyone. My name is Matt Rear, and I'm the Vice President of Teaching and Learning at American Reading Company. And it's truly my honor to welcome you all to what promises to be a lively discussion with Dr. Irvin Scott, David Liben, and Meredith Liben, and you. That's right, the chat box is open the entire time, so feel free to toss in your questions, comments, and celebrations as we unpack their newest book, Know Better, Do Better, Comprehension. Perhaps you already have your copy, perhaps it looks a little bit like mine already. But Know Better, Do Better Comprehension gives us a deeper understanding of all the systems and processes at play in readers' minds and encourages our instruction to grow out of the research on how comprehension actually happens. And that's a quote from the introduction of the book. Today's discussion will highlight the important role of asking questions, expanding vocabulary, and building knowledge. But you don't want to hear about it from me. So I'm going to ask for David Liben and Meredith Liben to introduce themselves. And then we'll come back together so I can introduce you to the moderator for today's discussion. So why don't we toss it to Meredith Liben? You want to kick us off?
Hi, I'm Meredith Liben.
Hi, after 75 years, I remain David Liben.
And we're really happy to be with you. We always love the energy and focus around anything American Reading Company sponsors. So we're hoping you throw questions at us and push back and do all the things.
Excellent. And thank you so much for being here. We're going to hear a lot more from Meredith and David in the next 55 minutes or so. And again, if you have questions, put them in the chat box. But now allow me to introduce you to the moderator for today's discussion, Dr. Irvin Scott. In addition to serving as a member of American Reading Company's Academic Advisory Council, Dr. Scott has also walked the walk that allows him to talk the talk. He spent 20 years serving students across the country as a teacher, principal, district administrator. He worked for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And this spring, he published Leading with Heart and Soul, also available on Amazon. With that being said, Dr. Scott, take it away.
Thank you so much, Matt. Really, really appreciate that introduction. Incidentally, I don't know if anyone has seen Matt coach other teachers, but he is phenomenal. He's just amazing at what he does. And so we really appreciate him. I'm so excited about facilitating this conversation. I must say, before I jump right into it, I was sitting here thinking to myself, this is absolutely amazing that we're able to have these conversations. And we're able to have them with teachers and principals, and district leaders and practitioners who are doing the work on the ground in the field. Incidentally, we celebrate all of you as you're probably kicking off the school year, and just really, really appreciate the opportunity to take this time to engage with you. But at Harvard Graduate School of Education, we talk a lot about policy, practice, and research. Policy, practice, and research. And what these conversations are doing when we bring you together is sort of, we're doing a conversation at the intersection of all three of those right now, because there's a lot of policy discussions going on around the science of reading. It's happening across the country. It's happening in different states in different ways, and even nationally. And obviously, you're doing the work on the ground, so that practice focus is happening on a day-to-day basis. And then what this book does a beautiful job of is bringing in some of the research to inform the practice that you're doing on a day-to-day basis. And we would hope ultimately inform also that policy discussion. So it's awesome to be able to bring all of those together. And hopefully you can take away some ideas that you can begin to apply on the ground in your work on a day-to-day basis. Let me jump right into the conversation with David and Meredith. Thank you so much for joining us. They wrote this wonderful book, and I've been reading it, not completely done with it, but I've been going through it, and I'm enjoying it as a former teacher and principal. I actually want to start at the beginning of the book. There's this wonderful story that happens. David tells the story at the beginning of the book related to a young child when David was a principal. young child who sees a sign, and then it triggers this wonderful revelation for David that I think sets up the book very nicely. So this is as a teaser for you to get the book. David, can you tell the audience a little more about that experience and why it was so pivotal for you to actually start the book with it?
Certainly. Thank you, Dr. Scott. Well, this story is referred to as No Spitting. I'm on the bus going to, I was a principal of really, at this point, one of the largest, if not the largest, schools in Harlem, and going to a meeting at the district office, which the district office always set up during rush hour. And I was in the bus, and I'm right next to this young girl and her mother. And the young girl's looking up at a sign, which says, no spitting. And she asks her mom, what's that word after no? And the child goes, and the mom goes, spitting. And the child goes, ooh. And she looks back up at the sign and she says, you mean there's some people that need to be told that? And the mother says something along the lines of, yes, there are some people who do need to be told that. Then the child goes back to the text. This was even before the Common Core, but she was a Common Core oriented child. She returned to the text for evidence. She goes back to the text and says, who put that sign on the bus? And the mother explains that it wasn't the bus company, that it was the people who run the buses, who run the city. And the child then goes back to the sign again, looks at it. Clearly, she's still thinking. And she says, I don't think that's going to work. They need to put a policeman on the bus. So let's just go through what this child went through in this process. First of all, she recognized part of the text. No, she was a preschool child because public school had already started. So she was in preschool. And she recognized the word the word no, N-O. And then she asked the question, which, by the way, is often considered a comprehension strategy. Then when the mother answered the question, she made an inference, also a comprehension, what's considered a comprehension strategy, connected it to what she knew about the world. No one in her family would need to do that. And then she looked back at it again, and she made another connection to what she knew about the world. And she extended her thinking about it to say, well, I don't think this is going to work. If there's some people like this, they need to put a policeman on the bus. So in the period of a short couple of minutes, she asked the question, she made inferences, she made connections, she synthesized all the information, and she drew a conclusion. She's 4 years old. She did all this in 2 minutes. We teach these constructs, asking questions, making inferences, synthesizing, drawing conclusions. We teach these constructs as isolated, atomistic, individual elements in our literacy program. Now, there are many of them. They're in the standards. They're in comprehension strategies. Before that, they were in objectives, the focus for the day. Rather than looking at the text as a whole, as this child did, thinking about it, thinking about what it means, synthesizing the information, drawing conclusions. Instead, we atomize them and teach them one at a time, really over a course of, in many instances, 13 years. We were asked to evaluate the literacy program in the Detroit public schools in order to make changes.
Open the path for new materials.
Thank you. And they had a program, a literacy program, before the current administration that was, well, Ms. McGraw-Hill. And
it was 15 years old.
Right. Well, it wasn't, at that point, maybe. But not so old that it didn't teach comprehension strategies. They began in kindergarten by teaching children what an inference was. They literally gave a lesson on what an inference was. There were lessons in the 12th grade text on what an inference is. 13 years of learning what an inference is. This could produce some kind of damage to the brain for sure. And so it raises the question of I'm thinking about writing a book about this, but it raises the question of how and why did we get into that situation? It doesn't reflect the way the brain learns to read. It doesn't make sense. And it's certainly not motivating and valuing the child and the child's natural intellect and curiosity.
Powerful. It's just a powerful story that sheds light on what this young child was doing at a very early age, and making inferences and posing questions and tapping into prior knowledge. It's just a powerful story. And then it sets up nicely the discussion around this whole focus on reading and knowledge. And so that leads me to my next question, which is, so why did you write the book? That was a wonderful setup for the story. Why did you write the book, if someone asked you?
Well, because we did all those things too. I don't want anybody who's on here and stuck with materials that may overemphasize learning strategies and have kids practice in isolation and atomizes reading to feel, which our core does not do. Actually, it does a nice job of building knowledge and inviting curiosity. So that's not, but we do what we do. And literally the title of both our books has been Know Better, Do Better. And then the first one was about foundational skills, why it's important and why we can't just assume kids are going to fall into it magically. This book is about comprehension and how the mind makes meaning and what the implications are. Because we did all these things. We taught strategies. We tell the story of how we had the lowest reading scores in the city of New York when we started our own school, and our first second graders were the final second graders to be tested citywide. At which point we usually ask, why are you on a webinar listening to people who are confessing they got the lowest reading scores in New York City with their young school?
It's a big city. That's pretty impressive.
And so we have made these mistakes and agonized over them and banged our heads on the pillows or just got up and paced the floor in our apartment. So, but we learned from it and we did better with our kids. And we basically wrote these books to shortcut that journey for other people, because we have spent decades in classrooms as teachers, principal David, or doing this work ourselves. And the other thing I want to say is we hope we always bring a level of humility and storytelling on ourselves to our work, because that is certainly how we learned. But also, we like to cry. We don't want anybody crying bullshit on us. Like we know what it feels like to teach. It is the hardest work, way the hardest work. Being a teacher, being outside the classroom, being a principal is hard work too. But at least you can go to the bathroom when you want to. So it's so hard. And now we have spent time advising publishers or consulting with schools. We need to keep the humility of what we learned and the mistakes we made in the conversation, because as opposed to just lecturing at people or pretending we've always known this stuff and never been on their journey. So that's why we wrote the book. We're also getting older. We wanted to leave behind some of the best of what we know about research, the intersectionality of research and practice.
Love that intersectionality of research and practice, and really appreciate the focus on humility. The focus on you actually have a section where you talk about some of the things that you did wrong when you were first starting out. And I think that's really powerful. We probably have a lot of people on this call right now who are trying to figure out whether they're doing right or wrong. And so being explicit about that, but also, and this is the title, once you're really emphasizing the importance of moving forward and doing better, which is a powerful part of this book. Let's jump right into one of the early chapters, which has to do with knowledge and comprehension. So one of the things that I'm hoping people will go away with after this call is actually some nuggets they can actually begin putting into practice right away. Can you talk a little bit about what the research says about the importance of building knowledge in order for students to comprehend or understand text? You treat it really well in the text, the book itself, but maybe you can give us a real quick overview.
Yeah, so, and we do emphasize building knowledge, as Dr. Scott said, as opposed to activating background knowledge or prior knowledge. We really would love those terms to be shed out of the dialogue, because we see reading as the access point to whatever knowledge you want to learn, if you can read. But basically, every author has to make some assumptions about what people reading their book know, what they know prior to reading it. So that's what inferencing is. It's doing some of that work that the author left out and filling in those missing pieces. So if you don't know anything at all about the topic, you're going to have a really hard time doing that stuff. But you can learn from books. It's one of the most efficient ways to learn. So there's this interesting both and, another one of our favorite corny expressions, but we're big fans of both and. So you can learn from reading, and you need some knowledge to access the knowledge in the book. So we believe in sort of just-in-time dollops of support for kids and scaffolds, as opposed to just in case, where you sort of lay down every scaffold and build it up so the kid, there's a rubberized platform so nobody can possibly bang their knee up on the way to learning something. So let the kids read, let them learn from what they read, and then they will bring that to the books. So you want to go into volume of reading and how powerful that is as a construct?
Sure. There's some really elegant research, and we're happy to send anybody any of the research that we mentioned here. If you reach out to American Reading Company or us directly, we could do that, showing how a volume of reading has lifelong effects in making people better readers and in many other ways of people's lives. But there's some also more recent research showing that a volume of reading, meaning reading a series of texts on a topic, not only grows knowledge better, but also grows tier 2 vocabulary. So you might think about it as tier 3 and tier 2 vocabulary, tier 3 being domain vocabulary. And what that means is that when students read a series of texts on a topic, it could be it could be birds, it could be dinosaurs, it could be explorers, it could be the Harlem Renaissance, it could be any kind of topic. And if you read a series of texts on a topic, you grow knowledge of the world that sticks in your brain more than jumping around from topic to topic, which kind of makes sense. But you also grow tier 2 vocabulary or non-domain related vocabulary. My favorite example comes from a 3rd grade lesson in a program that does include growing knowledge by reading a volume of text on a topic, as American Reading Company does. And it's a unit on sea mammals. And it comes to the dolphins. Students had not read about dolphins before, but they've been learning about sea mammals. And in 1.5 pages, it says the dolphins ascend to the surface. Well, the kids could figure out ascend right away because they've been studying sea mammals and they know that they don't have gills, they have lungs. So they have to go up to the surface to breathe. And then it says they descend. Well, the kids know they descend because that's where they get the food from. Well, in between ascending and descending, they were on the surface. So the kids had a real beginning, if not a complete ending, of learning 3 powerful tier 2 words that don't apply that are not domain related: ascend, descend, and surface. That is a far more meaningful, interesting, intellectually validating way to learn vocabulary than any kind of vocabulary exercise or vocabulary game or activity. And we're not saying those don't have any meaning. It's kind of like what Meredith said earlier. It's another both and
it's sticky when it's connected to content. And if you care about, and a lot of times we'll hear, well, kids don't want to read about dolphins and sea mammals for a long time. Well, they're actually pretty interesting. And most things are interesting if once you get to read about them and learn about them. And the natural world is interesting. Kids like to learn about the world and how it works, how things work and what's in the world and why their bodies work the way. All these things are intrinsically interesting. So the knowledge is sticky. And as you get more confidence in the content, you can pay attention because of what David said. You know a bit about the topic, so you can pay attention to more sophisticated syntax and actually manage it. This has really clear implications for multilingual learners too. because you're more sophisticated, so you understand that if the dolphins play, often play when they after they've fed, or I don't even know if that's accurate, but they do this simultaneously. They rise to the surface simultaneously. You can say, I know they all come up together because they swim in a school, they're together. Simultaneous must mean at the same time. And even if you only have a glimpse of simultaneous, it starts to lock in. And I'm talking third graders, young kids that can get this. And this comes from read aloud also. So before you can access the text with your own eyes and your own decoding skills, you can be read to. And we all do it with our own kids and our neighborhood. We definitely do this. We stop and explain. And if kids get an obsession, we follow it. We would never tell our own child, no, you've read 4 books about Ninja Turtles. We're done. No more. No, you would honor that passion and you'd follow it. And that child learns a lot of ancillary vocabulary as a result. So we're talking about bringing those same truths, because they are research-based truths about humans and how we learn, into the classroom and making it systematic and regular.
Yeah, what's so interesting about just this exchange regarding knowledge is that we start off the conversation talking about knowledge, and you immediately went into talking also about vocabulary and the acquisition of vocabulary. Can you say a little more about how the acquisition of vocabulary and knowledge oftentimes go hand in hand when you're doing it well?
I think what happens is we're all familiar as educators, we're most likely familiar with vocabulary and context. Teach students to determine the meaning of a term from context. Well, what's the context? It's usually stated that the context is the other words. Well, but the context, as the dolphin story tells, is also the topic, or is also the knowledge demands. So that's why there's this interactive relationship, interactive and symbiotic, that accelerates both students' growth of knowledge and students' growth of vocabulary. You could put it as, and E.D. Hirsch put it this way decades ago, knowledge of words and knowledge of the world. They have a symbiotic relationship that accelerates as a student continues to read. And that's why the research is so powerful. And there's research by Stanovich and Cunningham that we could send you on the volume of reading. And there's the research by Cervetti on Wright more recently. Do you think we have time to go into the Cervetti and Wright study? It takes about three or 4 minutes to explain.
Well, actually, when you say study, someone just asked a question in the chat that might be connected to what you're getting ready to talk about. Because someone said, how do I access research on the volume of reading? Like, is there research on this notion of volume of reading? Maybe that's different from the study that you're just talking about, but I wanted to make sure I threw that question out there.
There's two pieces of research that fit together. They're not exactly the same. One is Stanovich and Cunningham, and if you just Google Stanovich and Cunningham volume of reading, you'll get it.
It's this, right?
Yes, what reading does for the mind.
Great.
And then the other is the study I mentioned by Cervetti and Wright and Wang, and that's like, I think 2009, but I could be wrong about the date. What they did was they had students read two series of texts. Well, each group read one series. One group read a series of 5 or 6 texts on birds. The other group read a series of 5 or 6 texts that jumped from topic to topic. So it could be birds, it could be sea mammals, could be explorers, could be Godzilla. 5 or 6 different topics. But what they did was they implanted into these 5 or 6 topics for the same tier 2 words that are not connected to the domain. Words like serious, various, interpret, those kind of words. And then they measured how many of those words were learned by each group. Did the group that read a series of texts about birds learn more of those words than the group that read 5 or 6 texts on different topics? And sure enough, the group that read the series of texts about birds learned those words more. But they're also, what they're learning about birds is going into their long-term memory more because each text in each text synthesizes and reinforces what was in the earlier text, which is, by the way, what we're supposed to be teaching kids to do: use text to learn how to read about the world in a systematic, coherent way. So lo and behold, who would have thunk? The kids actually learned more words and more about the world by doing it that way. And this is essentially what is behind the research on text sets. That we did a lot of work on text sets when we were both working at Student Achievement Partners. Many of you may know about Student Achievement Partners, know about the website, and that's achievethecore.org. And there's everything you want to know about text sets there. The research behind it that we're talking about it, but also what is a text set exactly? How do you create a text set? How do you teach through the text set? And this is the research that's behind that. The other piece of research.
The other thing is knowledge-rich materials, and people are doing a good job in the chat of supplying these links. Knowledge-rich programs like our core do this for you, which I think there's also, just a little aside when we talk about how hard teaching is, being the writer of your own plays, your own stage manager, your own sets builder, and then the actor every day, all day, and then all night. It is hard. So we're believers in materials that do a lot of the hard work for you, not that you have to be slavishly, reading every single aspect or doing all of them. A lot of them are too rich to do everything, but we do believe in high quality, rich materials that do some of this curating and selecting and asking of questions and offer scaffold and do a wonderful job of supporting multilingual learners and newcomers and kids that speak different dialects, all the things. So yes, that you can build your own text sets, and if if you have the energy and time to do that, that's wonderful. But good materials do that.
Of course, if you don't have materials that do that, text sets are way better than nothing.
Yes.
Yeah. We got into a real quick conversation before we were coming on that sort of connects to this train of thought we're on right now around individuals. There may be teachers out there who say, you know what, I've been doing this particular unit and this particular focus on sharks or this particular focus on horses, and I just love it. But the district is beginning to move away from what I can sort of do on my own. What would you say to them, to teachers who are saying that I have a unit that really works for me, and it's been working for years, but we're sort of moving away from my ability to do that unit? Any advice that you would give to a teacher who feels like they have something that's been working?
I think that's a super important question. There's two things that we recommend. One, if you've done something successfully in the past and you've loved it and your students have loved it, it's very likely. Let me put it the other way. It's very unlikely that this did not benefit your students. That's number one. Number two, what you can do now that we're all entering into at different stages, the science of reading, take that new unit, whether it's a whole unit or whether it's just a book, full-length work that you've done, and integrate into it some of the concepts that you've learned about the science of reading. And that will enhance it even more.
Yeah, refresh the questions, refocus it, and make it fit in. Figure out something else that you can swap out to make time. Otherwise, we always did that. When people have been asking questions about our practice, we always did that. I mean, we didn't have a lot. We had to build our own materials, and I know, and we were lucky to be resourced and able to do that and hire ourselves and other teachers in the summer to do it. But
yeah, it's called working 16 hours a day. That's what it's called.
But we also had resources because the school was well supported, that we ran in New York for a while.
Yeah, so you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
If you've got something that's been working, there are ways to modify it with these new techniques aligned to the science of reading and continue to use what really seems to resonate for kids.
Exactly. Otherwise, you're going to end up fighting with, what did we call? We had a colleague who used to call it quiet
Quitting.
Not quite quitting, no, that's more modern. But basically,
That is more modern.
ways to sabotage, quiet sabotage, right? I mean,
It's a
teachers,
phrase having to do with
Yeah.
closing the door, I think.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Closing the door, doing what you want. We all,
Exactly. I want to segue to another question, still within the knowledge, but then I'm gonna shift to a different set of questions. As I was reading, something stuck out to me. I think you do this quite a bit in a nice way in the book, where you give nods to former research, or former people who have done thinking. Sometimes what happens with education researchers or leaders, they act like they've discovered everything. You guys don't do that. You're like really give nods to individuals who've done research and thinking. And one of them is Rudine Sims Bishop, who talks about an inclusive reading, windows, mirrors, and was it sliding doors? Can you say something about that real quick? Because I think it speaks nicely to cultural responsive teaching is what we talk about it to.
Yeah, thank you, because I missed the little window that I could have slipped it in before. The other thing about knowledge building is the equity implications of it, and it became clearer and clearer to us. So it's Nadine Sims Bishop, I believe, is the woman who came up with this lovely phrase, and I was pretty mad that I didn't know about her before. I've heard the phrase, but I didn't know she had originated it, so she's not given the credit she's due. So, but people may be familiar with the notion. If you're not, the idea is that everybody deserves to read books where they're looking through a window at another world, and so they learn and other places. So they learn about things they are not familiar with. But everybody also needs at times to have a touchstone where it's a mirror, where the characters, the background, the environment, the experiences do resonate with them. There is some familiarity to start to bootstrap yourself, if you will, that great American phrase that isn't often actualized. But it's easier to bootstrap if there's a lot of familiarity and a lot of comfort there. And then sliding glass doors, I'm a hopeless romantic reader of fantasies, but so I always, Narnia pops into my head of like walking through the wardrobe, but places where you can actually envision yourself joining in that world. So, that could be reading books about women who became mathematicians and started to work for NASA because you didn't know that your love of math could actually translate into joining the astronauts and helping with their work. And so reading a book like that can that's the sliding glass door. You mean I could do that? There's a job like that. So that's the sliding glass door, or just pure, I want to inhabit that world for a few weeks because, that's that. So, and what's happened in the equity so what is interesting is you have to work harder as a reader if you are doing windows, because you don't have those points of reference. Working harder happens to make it's very good for your reading, right? Stamina, stick-with-itness, these are all things we value. And they in fact, you do need to learn what to do and be encouraged to stay with it when the going gets hard. So if you never read windows, if you're always reading mirrors, there's more points of contact. It's actually easier. It's comfortable. You can stay in a more comfortable place. We all deserve that too. And you might even do better in the moment with the questions or the things that you're
not growing at the
but you're
rate
not
that you should.
growing as a reader. Your reading muscles aren't actually being developed. So this is a disservice across, so we're talking equity here, and we have a deep investment in designing at the margins of people who aren't considered and making sure there are more mirrors for people at the margins, because that's who we've been neglecting. But we firmly believe that designing at the margins benefits everybody. I think that revelation that like suburban kids who constantly have a diet of, realistic fiction that's set in a suburban setting like theirs they could grow flaccid as readers if we're not careful. So, and that's not helpful to them either. So let alone they don't get to learn about different worlds in different ways.
Yeah.
So,
that is a very rich part of this book. And I just really, really appreciate it being in there. And I really appreciate your explanation. I won't repeat it, but I hope everyone got it, because there was really there's power in and books that are focused, that are window focused. There's power in books that are mirror focused. And the sliding glass story. I must be honest, I had not heard of Sims Bishop until I read your book. And to me,
Such a
it's
fact.
like,
Yeah, it's given to other people, truthfully.
Yeah.
Other people have co-opted it a
that's
little.
very true. And she's a woman of color. She's an African American woman. And so I'm like, what is going on here? But I think that speaks to a lot of systemic issues that we know exist and in our education system, which we've got to do something about, which I attribute your book to, actually.
Thank you. That means a
So
lot.
really appreciate that. Let's jump in a little bit into this notion of fueling the reading brain. What you can do to fuel the reading brain. And you talk a little bit about artful questioning, and the whole comprehension vault. Can someone just maybe touch a little bit on that? When I was a principal, I just say this real quick. When I was a principal, one of the things that I would do when I was a high school English principal, as an English teacher, one of the things that I would do when I go into observe teachers is just track the questions that they were asking students, no matter what class, algebra class, literature class, geography class, just track questions and then try to track where those questions are on Bloom's taxonomy. Talk a little bit about how you guys think about question and this notion of the comprehension block.
I'll start off. Meredith could probably make it more artful. The most basic idea, because we're talking, one of the big shifts in the world of literacy was complex text. When everybody was only reading things that they can kind of sort of read on their own, it wasn't that problematic. If the text is easy, and less complex, it's a different ballgame than when it's more complex. And with the Common Core standards, and this has stuck around, we're asking everybody to read complex text because grade level, because we're giving up this idea of kids only read at their own level and they stay there stuck in Fontes and Pinnell apartheid forever. So if the text is complex, what makes the text complex? What makes the text complex is the features of the text. Not only the vocabulary and knowledge demands, and we'll come back to that, but how complex is the syntax? How many connections have to be made between the ideas in one part of the text and another part of the text? How about the theme? Is the theme subtle? Are there multiple themes? And how about the directness of the author? Is the author making it easier to make these connections, or is the author not making any attempt, or is not making it easier? Whether the author is planning that or not is irrelevant. Does the writing make the connections between the ideas explicit or implicit, and to what degree in each case? So these are all the features of the text, but they interact. So for example, it's well known that more complex syntax makes a text more difficult. But if the words in those sentences are relatively high frequency or words that students are more likely to know, then the complex syntax does not throw as much of an obstacle to comprehending. Subtle themes can be complex, but if the knowledge demands that are needed in that text to get your head around those subtle themes, then those subtle themes don't present so much of a difficulty. It's the interaction between the features of the text that determine the complexity. So why not ask questions that address that complexity and see how kids are dealing with it, and have the kids explain their thinking, which also has very solid research in the world of cognitive psychology. And then what's happening is you're looking at a text, you're analyzing a text in many ways together with the kids, and you're addressing those features of the text that through the questions, you're addressing those features of the text that make it complex. That's not very artful, but I turn it over to my colleague of the last 4 years to make it more artful.
Well, I want to pounce on something Dr. Scott said a while ago about, things you can take away from here, because we often think about, okay, if there was one thing we had to pin on, pin our hopes on for this book, it would be what David just said, having students explain their answers. to each other, sometimes in their own heads, right? Gather their thoughts in writing, but in dialogue. Somebody was taught, I hope we get to sort of language rich classrooms and how essential they are for inviting students in and equalizing the sharing of knowledge and floating everybody's boats. But if you explain your answer and it's a text base, you went to a hard, challenging section of the text, pronoun references got really funky or whatever it was that was going on that David just said. And then you ask a question that pushes kids' attention, because that's what questions do, right? They force attention to go somewhere. The question asker has directed the reader's attention to a specific place. And so they're very scaffolded. It's not the whole book. You're looking here at this thing and thinking about it. So if a student is answering, they either got the question right or they got it wrong. In explaining their answer, either way, and this is stealing a page from Japanese lesson study, and that took over mathematics, and for some reason never was invited in to reading, where it kind of belongs, in my opinion. I mean, it belongs everywhere, but in that, so right or wrong, right? So if the student got it right, and they can point to the evidence, how they built that understanding and that correct inference or understanding, every kid in that room their antenna are on that student, because everybody wants to know, everybody wants to succeed. That is absolutely true in a classroom. Kids fade out when they feel there's no opening for them to succeed. So everybody's listening to that correct student work their way through how they understood. If the student got it wrong, they will start on the road to explaining, and they will either self-correct, which is super powerful, or there will be a collective course correction on behalf of that student. Again, in that dialogue, other kids probably made the same error. So it will invite everybody again into the learning of what was so hard there, what went on, and then let's build understanding together. So we see close reading as deeply communal, sort of collective understanding. At times, obviously, you need to make sure everybody can do this for themselves. But the real learning happens as a collective for the class, and it should raise everybody.
And it creates that kind of intellectual community.
Yeah.
I mean, there were always, our kids knew they had to explain their answers all the time, which also makes a big difference when they know they're going to have to do that. But there would always be instances where I wish I would remember some of the names, but this is a while ago. And kids would say, "Mr. Liben, I really understand this. I really know I can't, but I can't explain it. Could you ask Jose? He's much better at explaining than I am." So it becomes part of the culture of the class, and then of the school.
Yeah, it makes me this whole discussion around explaining your answer reminds me of a lesson that I saw when I was at the Gates Foundation. We were implementing Common Core across the country, and we were trying to find model lessons that we would then put on video and share and through different mediums before big time social media. But one of the lessons that I remember a teacher teaching, the title of it was "My Favorite No." And this was a math class. And basically what she would do is she would take an answer that was wrong and try to explain to the students why it's her favorite wrong answer. And a lot of it had to do with how the student got to that answer. It was wrong, but the thinking was really good, right? And so this notion of explaining your thinking is really powerful.
Putting it on display for everybody.
Putting it on display for everybody. Exactly. All right, I'm looking at our time. This conversation is powerful. I want to make sure if people have questions. I haven't really paused to have people put questions in the chat, but put your questions in the chat. I'll try to get to them. But I want to hit on at least two more topics in our exchange. One, Meredith just brought up, which is language-rich classrooms and why that's so important in this discussion. I want to just talk a little bit about that. And then the other is writing, which you talk about in chapter 8, and that actually builds nicely on another conversation that we had at American Reading Company through a previous webinar. and the power of writing. So who wants to kick us off with the idea of language-rich classrooms and why that is sort of deeply connected to this discussion at the same time?
Well, part of it we talked about, that close reading is not this, where the kid's nose is pressed an inch away from the book. It's actually, I think of it as the teacher staying close to students while they engage in this intellectual inquiry. So again, collecting your thoughts is valuable. I used to teach community college online, and I would find thoughtful students who were quiet when we were in person, or sometimes would shine when they had a chance to collect their answers. So you want both. You want students to have to think for themselves before they talk, or at least in partners. You could do linguistic partners or whatever. But the discussion, the intellectual inquiry, and the invitation to all to contribute, it just invites everybody into the conversation. It's way more fun and lively and interesting, and it hands learning over to the collective student. So that's with close reading. Jumping back to vocabulary, a lot of questions end up being about the knowledge demands or vocabulary, because, as David often jokes, reading has a lot to do with words. So if you think about morphology and etymology and the power they play in the English language in particular, since it's a river that grew out of many streams. The English themselves were invaded a number of times, by the Normans and Saxons and Romans and French, like I say, were the Normans. But anyway, so you have, this crazy language before we even had the richness of people coming to the Americas with different language and place names, et cetera. So English gets complicated. So there's lots of power for kids from different linguistic backgrounds bringing their knowledge in when you're talking about vocabulary, with cognate use that should be baked into materials and conversation. And then taking time to tell the story of a word, which we have a few anecdotes about in the book, and doing that out loud invites a curiosity or an attention to words and what they're communicating that also is best put on display and processed orally. So again, interest, keeping the kids engaged. Everybody deserves to be able to voice their thoughts and opinions, and it levels the playing field too daily. If you have a highly verbal classroom with chances for kids to talk multiple times a day, everybody multiple times a day in various formations.
When you have to express it orally in front of a group, then the language that comes out is going to be much richer, more complex, and more accurate than when you're first formulating those ideas inside your head. Examples are really important in literacy, always. I'm reading right now Dolores Kearns Goodwin, an unfinished romance about her lifelong relationship with Richard Goodwin, who was a speechwriter for John F. Kennedy. And so there's this section after Kennedy won, right that day after Kennedy won after the inauguration. Goodwin is walking around looking for his office, and he accidentally stumbles into the Oval Office. And Kennedy's in the Oval Office, and Kennedy, who apparently wasn't one much at that point, it wasn't much for small talk, I guess, said, referring to the parade, said, "Did you notice the Coast Guards?" And Goodwin says, "No, what about the Coast Guards?" They had no idea.
It was freezing.
And yeah, all I was trying to do was to stay warm. And in those days, it could still get cold in Washington in January. So Kennedy says there was no black. There was not one black person in that contingent. And apparently that was Kennedy's way to describe that, to describe the situation.
To issue marching orders.
Yeah, thank you, to issue marching orders. And so Goodwin goes out and says, "Okay, the Coast Guard." "Well, who's in charge of the Coast Guard?" "Apparently it's the Treasury." "I didn't know that," he says.
Makes sense, because they protect the coast from.
So look at what both, when I read that to myself, basically I was just stringing together a series of concepts. Kennedy doesn't talk much. Kennedy, no small talk, in office. Goodwin doesn't know what Coast Guard is, etc. Basically, little nuggets of ideas. And then I move on to the next part of the text. But having to explain that orally, it took two of us to get it right, develops the language. When you take the parts of a text that create meaning, and you have to elaborate and express those, especially to your peers, you're developing language that you do not get otherwise.
And then to segue from oral language to writing, you're taking it one step further, right? So to gather and organize your thoughts is hard. And if students are frequently writing about what the currency that they share in common in the classroom, that they've all had access to because of close reading, and are taking it a step further by cementing their ideas in writing, first of all, it's great assessment, right? Because you get to see what each student can do. They've just read complex rich text, so they have models that they might not have had access to otherwise if you hadn't had that sort of moving from language rich to writing. And but they need support, and one support is having something to write about that they've gained confidence that they know, and that can come from volume of reading or this kind of close examination. And it is the best way to know, to see, to have a left behind artifact, if you will, of what we learned when we did this thinking and did this work. So so it lays those tracks down for students to look at themselves and realize. And so, but we also talk about how to support writing. We think writing about what you've read, what everybody has read and gotten some confidence about is one huge thing.
Which is in the DNA of American Reading Company.
Yeah. And then we talk about how to support sentence construction and also questions. As I said before, I didn't overtly say this, but questions are great scaffolds for students because you don't have to think about everything. You have to just think about where this question pushes you. And it could be a hard part of the text if it's a good question, but it is a scaffold because it helps give you a hint about what they want you to do in the eyes of a student. If you're writing or if you're accountable for what you read in a less structured way, you actually have to summarize or come up with the main point, do some kind of analysis of writing yourself. That is the ultimate, right? That is.
Yeah, you want to find out the hardest, hand out a text and give the kids one word, respond.
Yeah, and then also kids will get paralyzed, right? Because they haven't had any scaffolds. So, but still gradual release, we want our students to interact with the book on their own, with text on their own, and get something from it and be able to know that they got something from it. So the ultimate release of, I forgot the phrase, but anyway, the ultimate independent action is for a student to interact with the text and then record their response to it.
Gradual release of
Gradual
responsibility.
release, thank you. Which we don't really do a very good job of figuring out for kids.
Yeah, if I'm hearing you correctly, you said the ultimate sign of that release is for students to write something, for them to make meaning of something that they've read, if I heard you correctly.
Yes.
That's powerful. That's powerful. So think about gradual release as reading, and then perhaps talking to someone, and sharing their thinking about it, and then ultimately putting it down on paper. Each level requiring the brain to go to another level of complexity is what's happening in that exercise, which is really powerful.
And it's what we all do as adults. I mean, if you have a high stakes thing to put out, you show a trusted, you either talk about it with somebody before you try to write it, or you show it to somebody in draft form. I mean, again, trying to replicate those at scale in classrooms is good, going to end up with good practice.
Yeah. Meredith, you said something again about a point that I don't want people to miss, which is I thought was really powerful. You talked about earlier, and you just mentioned it again, just-in-time scaffolding versus
just in case.
Just-in-case scaffolding. And that's a really powerful concept. I don't want to articulate it the way you articulate, but can you say one more time what you mean by that? Because I think that's something that we do a lot in classrooms. And it's something that people could potentially work on beginning tomorrow.
And I learned it from my work with the multilingual learner community, because there has been in that world there was sort of a tendency to hold the space, do all the work in advance for students sometimes, and not and just assume that these poor babies knew nothing instead of tapping in. And so that's there's been a ton of growth there and lots of vibrancy, and that's, you know, lots of chafing along the way of those movements. But that's where this expression has come out of some of that work that I've gotten a chance to do. I'm
Yeah.
not by no means an expert, but I'm a learner. So so that idea that it's hard to, with 20 kids, 30 kids, you're not going to assume accurately. You don't know who knows what and what knowledge is in that room. So so proceed and wait for students to need help. And then you do the just in time, as opposed to, I'm going to spend 20 minutes today showing 4 videos. You know, here's a whole front loaded vocabulary. I'm going to talk at them. I'm going to maybe prep a slideshow, and then we're going to read for a few minutes. You know, you really are robbing students of discovery, and you also are possibly aiming your bar quite low in terms of what the kids can do.
That's the key there. To me, it's low expectations. You just assume they can't. And back to the point where we started, where the powerful story, that little girl she was doing a whole lot of great thinking. All right. In the midst of trying to understand one word, she was doing some amazing thinking. One final question before we bring this wonderful discussion to a close. I love the way we posed it here. What is left to be said that we didn't get to? And I'm sure there's a ton. But what's one takeaway you would probably leave the group with around both your book, but even more so these ideas that inform effective science of reading implementation?
Well, there's a lot of things, as you said, but volume of reading is one. Volume of reading, meaning a series of texts on a topic, as we discussed, grows knowledge and grows vocabulary. The problem is the core ELA programs we have in our country, both the good ones and the not good ones, are a very full day.
Mm.
And when is this volume of reading going to take place? We cannot count on reading at home. Some kids will go home and read up a storm. Some kids will read very little at home for a variety of reasons. And then there's those in between. But if you count on it, if you count on a volume of reading, and it could be just X number of pages for the next day's lesson, and 30–40% of the kids didn't read it, it's very frustrating for teachers. So where does it, then if you want a volume of reading, you want them to read enough to grow the knowledge and to grow the vocabulary in the way that we talked about, that's got to be built into core ELA programs, and they're struggling with it. They're absolutely struggling with it. And American Reading Company is actually way ahead on that curve. I mean, we're great believers in these knowledge building programs. We've worked between the two of us with all of them, in some cases from the very beginning, including American Reading Company. But they've got it nailed because it's built into the program. They're studying a topic. There's a core text at grade level that everybody has to read. So you've got that reading of complex text, which is essential. And then you pick your subtopic. So if you're reading about the American Revolution, then you might pick as your subtopic Crispus Attucks at the Boston Massacre. You might pick indentured servant, or you might pick blacks in the American Revolution. You might pick slavery in the American Revolution. You might pick the Constitution. You pick your area that you're interested in, and there's a variety of texts at different complexity levels, because a volume of reading has to be text that kids can more or less read on their own. And then they go ahead and they read all of these different texts because they have to do a research report, which is a huge part of American Reading Company. So the volume of reading also, just quickly, when you know something about a topic, you're able to read more complex text about that topic. But the volume of reading here is built in. There's a number of minutes each day, substantial. I can't put a number on it, but it's substantial that kids are reading a series of texts on a topic. That grows knowledge, that grows vocabulary. We talked earlier about the features of text: multiple themes, subtle themes, multiple purposes, complexity, coherence, interaction, etc. But in writing this second book, we kind of knew this all along, but it became very clear when we tried to get a text and land on what are the features of that text that produce the most complexity and therefore the most difficulty. It was undoubtedly knowledge demands and vocabulary demands. So we're asking the nation to read complex text. The features of complex text that cause the most difficulty are knowledge demands and vocabulary. Yet we do not have in our programs the strongest, most powerful tool we have to grow knowledge and grow vocabulary. And that's a volume of reading built into the program so it actually happens. That's what I think has to be, that's the point I want to make.
Powerful.
Yeah, it is a struggle. And to not honor that with teachers and look for solutions with them is really a problem. So
Yeah. Well, art is moving in the right direction. You've heard it from David and Meredith, and it aligns to the research. This has been an amazing conversation. David and Meredith, thank you so much for joining. Let me turn it over to Matt to bring us to an official close.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for being here, to David, to Meredith, and to Dr. Irvin Scott. Yeah, you were talking about volume of reading, and I just was brought right back to my first grade classroom. We were a 100-book challenge school. Those kids read all day. To all of you who are still here, be it in your classroom, at your home office, or perhaps on your commute home, thank you so much for joining us today. It is our pleasure providing a space for all of us to gather and learn, and we look forward to doing much more of that as the school year continues. In fact, just next month in September, hey, how did that happen already? We have our Voices from the Field, the ultimate formative assessment on September the 25th. You see some names of colleagues on the screen from districts around the country who are going to share some of their thoughts and what's working in their systems. And we hope you'll consider joining us. Thank you so much for being here today. Have a wonderful rest of your week.